It was not gold nor oil that was poured into the veins of Burkina Faso that morning. It was life itself. 150 tons of shimmering tilapia, carp, and catfish cascading into the rivers like silver rain. Cameras rolled as soldiers guarded the boats and villagers erupted in disbelief and joy. For a landlocked nation long branded by hunger and drought, the spectacle was as shocking as it was unforgettable. To some abroad, it was madness. To those who lived by those rivers, it was nothing less than rebirth. And at the center of it stood one man, Ibrahim Traoré, a young leader who declared, not with speeches alone but with living proof, that food is power and sovereignty is survival. By releasing fish, he released a message that dignity does not come from foreign aid or frozen imports, but from rivers that once again feed their own people. So we ask, can fish truly redefine sovereignty? Or was it simply a gamble cast into uncertain waters? Stay with us, not just for headlines, but for the heartbeat of a continent. Subscribe and journey with us, for this is the Africa rising our elders dreamed of. On a morning that history would not forget, convoys of trucks rolled into riverside towns across Burkina Faso, carrying a cargo unlike any the nation had ever seen. Instead of soldiers readying for battle or foreign aid boxes stacked high with plastic logos, these trucks bore tanks of life. Inside churned tilapia, carp, and catfish, species chosen not at random, but with intent. They were fast-breeding, resilient, and familiar to the diets of the people. As the tanks opened, the spectacle resembled a festival of water. Soldiers stood in formation on boats, their rifles slung but their presence undeniable. Villagers gathered along the banks, gasped as waves of silver bodies spilled into rivers that for years had grown silent. Mothers clutched children to their chests, pointing toward the cascade of movement as if to say, "Look, our rivers breathe again." Cameras captured every angle, the boats creaking under weight, the fish swirling into currents, and the moment rivers once barren suddenly shimmered with promise. For decades, these waters had told a different story. Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation hemmed in by drought-prone plains, had leaned heavily on agriculture and livestock. Its markets depended on frozen fish hauled in by lorries from Ghana's Tema or Côte d'Ivoire's Abidjan. Wrapped in plastic, often thawed and refrozen, these imports became staples of urban stalls. Meanwhile, local rivers, once abundant with tilapia and catfish, grew depleted. Overfishing, climate stress, and neglect turned them into shallow beds where nets came up empty. Families who had relied on fish as cheap protein were forced to abandon it, leaving children malnourished and communities unbalanced. Generations of politicians had shrugged at this dependency, pointing to geography and climate as excuses. Burkina Faso cannot feed itself from its rivers, they argued, but Ibrahim Traoré refused that resignation. His decision to unleash 150 tons of fish was not a spontaneous stunt. It was staged, guarded, and deliberate, a declaration that sovereignty must begin at the dinner table. The choice of species mattered. Tilapia was prized for its speed of growth and adaptability to varying currents. Carp offered hardiness in riverbeds that shifted with drought. Catfish, with its reputation for survival even in shallow, oxygen-poor waters, symbolized resilience. Together, these fish represented not only sustenance, but strategy. Within their scales was encoded a vision: to rebalance ecosystems, to reduce dependence on foreign ports, and to restore dignity to villages long forgotten. As the fish hit the waters, cheers rose. Elders spoke of days when rivers ran thick with life, when birds circled above and crocodiles lingered near banks. Younger villagers, who had known only scarcity, marveled at the sight. In their eyes, it was not a political show. It was a promise. But to outsiders, the event seemed reckless. Economists abroad scoffed. Why gamble scarce resources on fish, they asked, when hospitals lack medicine and roads remain unpaved? Analysts warned that polluted waters from illegal mining would kill stocks before they matured. Opposition leaders at home branded the release a circus, accusing the government of indulging in spectacle while real problems festered. Yet to those who understood Traoré's vision, the symbolism was undeniable. Food, he argued, was not merely sustenance, it was stability. In a region where hunger had long been exploited as a weapon by insurgents, foreign interests, and corrupt elites, a well-fed population was harder to sway. Each fish that swam the rivers became more than potential protein. It became a safeguard against manipulation, a fragment of sovereignty reclaimed. The logistics themselves were staggering. Over 100 tanks had been prepared, each carrying thousands of fish bred in hatcheries specifically for the release. Military escorts ensured that no sabotage or theft disrupted the event. Traditional chiefs were invited to bless the rivers, invoking ancestral spirits to guard the life returning to their waters. Ministers stood alongside villagers, a rare moment where state and people shared the same riverbank. The message spread quickly. Within hours, images of fish pouring into currents went viral on African social media. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Dakar, youth movements reposted the footage, calling it a flood of dignity. In Paris and Brussels, African diaspora communities celebrated, contrasting the sight with decades of news about famine and aid dependency. Inside Burkina Faso itself, markets buzzed with speculation. Could these rivers truly feed the people again? Would nets that had been dry for years soon grow heavy? Would the nation, mocked as poor and powerless, prove capable of feeding itself without the plastic-wrapped imports of foreign corporations? As day turned to night, fishermen stood quietly by the banks, gazing at rippling waters. They had seen policies come and go, promises rise and vanish. Yet never had they seen policy made flesh, or rather made fin. The rivers now carried more than fish. They carried expectation, hope, and doubt. And so the stage was set. For some, the release was nothing more than a spectacle, destined to fade. For others, it was the first stone in building true sovereignty. But the question that lingered was inescapable. Would the gamble in the rivers prove to be a miracle of survival, or the opening act of national collapse? The spectacle of 150 tons of fish crashing into Burkina Faso's rivers was too vivid to be ignored. Within hours, the nation was divided between awe and ridicule. The rivers that once whispered silence now roared with life, and so too did the voices of its people and critics. For the villagers, the moment was transcendent. Along muddy banks, fishermen who had nearly abandoned their trade stood with renewed conviction. Their nets, for years dry and threadbare, promised weight once more. Mothers who had grown accustomed to bartering for frozen imports wrapped in foreign packaging now saw baskets of fresh tilapia within reach. Children laughed at the sight of silver fish thrashing at the edges of the river, pointing as though witnessing a miracle. In their eyes, Ibrahim Traoré had given not just fish but hope. Hope that the long drought of dependency might finally be over. But as jubilation spread through the villages, the political storm gathered force. Opposition figures in Ouagadougou wasted no time condemning the release. "A circus with scales," one lawmaker sneered in parliament. "We do not need rivers full of fish. We need hospitals full of medicine, classrooms with books, and roads without potholes." Their accusations were amplified on radio talk shows, branding Traoré reckless, naive, even delusional. Internationally, the mockery was louder still. European newspapers carried headlines dripping with irony. "A nation gambles on fish. Burkina Faso's silver rain or fool's gold?" Economists and think tanks from Washington to London dismissed the initiative as unsustainable. "You cannot solve hunger with fish," one analyst scoffed. "Not in a country plagued by mining pollution and climate change?" The tone was clear. What villagers celebrated, foreign commentators ridiculed as spectacle. And yet images told a different story. The video of Traoré, standing on a wooden boat flanked by soldiers, opening tanks and unleashing waves of life, spread like wildfire across social media. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Lagos, young Africans shared the footage with captions like, "This is sovereignty and food is freedom." In Paris and New York, members of the African diaspora reposted the clips, some with tears in their eyes. For too long, Africa had been shown to the world through famine, aid trucks, and dependency. Here was a leader who gave rivers back their fish, and with them, dignity. The optics mattered. Ibrahim Traoré did not stand at a podium delivering empty promises. He delivered action visible in the water, tangible in the markets, and unforgettable to those who witnessed it. His words, carried in what many now call the Ibrahim Traoré speech of the rivers, resonated far beyond his borders. A road may carry goods, but it cannot feed a child. A hospital may treat the sick, but it cannot prevent hunger. Solve hunger, and you solve unrest. Solve unrest, and you consolidate sovereignty. Supporters hailed him as visionary, even prophetic. He is not just our president, one fisherman told a reporter. He is the man who made our nets heavy again. Another mother in a riverside village declared, Ibrahim Traoré today did what no leader before him dared. He trusted our rivers to feed us again. Still, doubts gnawed at the edges of this newfound pride. Environmentalists cautioned that rivers choked by illegal gold mining might not sustain the new populations. Economists warned of corruption in fish markets that could strangle distribution. Skeptics predicted that, once the initial thrill faded, the reality of managing aquaculture would prove more difficult than releasing fish. But in those first days and weeks, evidence of change began to surface. Fishermen who had nearly given up their trade returned to rivers with renewed purpose. Markets in small towns buzzed with baskets of freshly caught tilapia. Children tasted fresh fish for the first time in years. Women organized cooperatives, smoking and salting catches for distribution to inland villages. It was more than economics. It was psychology. For decades, Burkina Faso had been cast as poor, dependent, and defeated by geography. Now the rivers themselves were whispering a new story. Radio hosts described it as a rebirth in the water. Community leaders framed it as a turning point. If rivers could be restored, what else could be reclaimed? Meanwhile, international media found themselves caught between mockery and grudging respect. A feature in one French newspaper admitted, "While critics laugh, villagers eat." An American commentator, initially dismissive, later acknowledged on television, "Perhaps Traoré understands politics better than we thought. A full stomach is a vote no speech can buy." The tension between ridicule abroad and pride at home only intensified the sense of drama. To the world, it was a gamble teetering on folly. To Burkina Faso, it was proof that sovereignty need not be begged for, but built, one river at a time. And so the nation stood on the edge of a paradox. Its leader had released life into the waters, but in doing so, he had also unleashed controversy across continents. Supporters called it rebirth. Critics called it madness. But everyone agreed on one point: it was unforgettable. And that left a question lingering in the air. Would the fish carry Burkina Faso toward freedom, or would the currents sweep the nation back into the tides of dependency? The rivers of Burkina Faso had always been more than geography. They were lifelines, carrying the memories of ancestors and the hopes of children. For years, those waters had run thin, drained of fish and dignity alike. But after the release of 150 tons of life, the currents began to tell a different story. What started as a presidential gamble quickly rippled through daily life, reshaping communities, markets, and politics. In the short term, the results were visible almost overnight. Fishermen who had nearly abandoned their craft now rose before dawn with nets in hand. Their catches, once meager, grew steadily heavier. Along market stalls, women displayed baskets of glistening tilapia, their voices carrying with pride as they called to buyers. For the first time in years, families who had endured meals of sorghum alone tasted fresh fish again. Children laughed as they chewed on protein their bodies desperately needed, their mothers whispering thanks that they no longer had to buy plastic-wrapped imports from distant ports. The revival was not confined to food. It ignited entrepreneurship. Women organized themselves into cooperatives, pooling resources to smoke, salt, and distribute fish to remote villages. Youth groups returned from cities drawn by the promise of work in riverside communities. Aquaculture projects flourished, with farmers receiving training in cage building and river management. Hatcheries multiplied, producing fry that guaranteed the rivers would not fall silent again. The rivers were no longer just places to fish. They became living factories of food, jobs, and dignity. Schools, too, felt the impact. Traoré's government moved swiftly to link nutrition programs with the fish revival. Contracts were awarded for dried and smoked fish to supply school lunches. Teachers reported improved concentration and attendance. Children who once slumped at their desks from hunger now carried sharper energy. A policy born in the rivers was shaping the minds of the next generation. Yet beneath these civil transformations lay deeper political consequences. For decades, the people of Burkina Faso had distrusted their leaders. Politicians were often seen as distant figures who promised much but delivered little. The fish release disrupted that cynicism. It was policy made visible, something you could touch, taste, and sell in the market. Each fish pulled from the water became a silent testament to governance that worked. The effect on loyalty was profound. Opposition voices continued to sneer, but their words found less traction among citizens whose lives had changed. "He does not just speak," one elder told a local radio station. "He feeds." In a country where hunger had long been weaponized, that distinction mattered. A population that eats is harder to manipulate, harder to recruit into insurgencies, and harder to turn against the state. By filling stomachs, Ibrahim Traoré was also filling the political reservoir of trust. This shift in perception extended to national identity. Burkina Faso, once painted as perpetually dependent, now carried a narrative of possibility. Elders reminded the youth that independence was not just about flags or speeches, but about the ability to feed your people from your own rivers and soil. Conversations in tea houses and markets reflected this awakening. If rivers could be revived, what else could be reclaimed? Land, minerals, self-respect. The psychological tide was turning. Of course, risks shadowed the gains. Corruption remained a threat, as local officials sought to monopolize distribution or skim profits. Illegal fishing loomed, threatening to strip stocks before they matured. Pollution from gold mining continued to poison waterways. Yet communities did not wait for the state alone. Villagers organized patrols to guard their rivers. Traditional chiefs imposed bans on fishing in sacred zones until populations recovered. Youth brigades monitored illegal activity and reported violations. The movement was not only state policy, it was a partnership between people and government. The international echoes of this transformation intensified the stakes. As villagers prospered, critics abroad were forced to reconcile their ridicule with results. Statistics confirmed what markets already showed. Fish imports were declining, local supply was rising, and malnutrition indicators were improving. What had once been dismissed as a spectacle was becoming evidence of foresight. And yet, every success raised the question of endurance. Could this grassroots momentum withstand external pressure? Import cartels feared for their profits. Development agencies worried that true food sovereignty would reduce their leverage. Politicians abroad fretted that an idea born in Burkina Faso might inspire similar awakenings across Africa. The stakes, then, were not just about rivers, but about sovereignty itself. A leader once mocked for pouring fish into streams had given his people something tangible: full nets, affordable markets, stronger children, and a restored sense of pride. Each benefit became another strand in a political fabric harder to tear apart. But history has never been gentle with dreams of independence. Dangers remained as persistent as the currents of the rivers themselves. Corruption, poaching, and external meddling could erode progress. If vigilance faltered, the waters could once again run empty, and dependency could return with quiet relentlessness. So the gamble of 150 tons of fish was not only ecological or economic, it was political, an attempt to bind people to their rivers, and their rivers to their sovereignty. The success or failure of that attempt would determine not only the fate of a government, but the dignity of a nation. And the question now hung in the air: could a flood of fish truly carry Burkina Faso into sovereignty? Or would unseen currents pull it back into the shadows of dependency? The ripples from Burkina Faso's rivers did not stop at its borders. What began as a spectacle of silver scales quickly drew the gaze of chancelleries, think tanks, and media outlets thousands of miles away. For many in the West, the sight of Ibrahim Traoré standing on a boat, pouring fish into his nation's rivers, was first a curiosity, then an irritation, and finally, something more unsettling. In Washington, the debate was almost schizophrenic. On one hand, policymakers had long preached the virtue of food security in Africa, urging governments to reduce hunger. On the other, the meaning of true self-reliance unsettled America's strategic calculus. If Burkina Faso could feed itself without aid, What would become of the leverage that food programs and development contracts provided? In think tanks across the city, experts whispered about geopolitics Africa and the possibility that protein independence might reshape alliances as surely as oil once did. Some dismissed Traoré as a populist. Others warned that his experiment could spread across the Sahel, eroding American influence in a region already contested by insurgents and foreign powers. Europe's reaction carried the same skepticism, laced with anxiety. Economists derided the fish release as unsustainable, pointing to fragile ecosystems and climate volatility. Yet behind closed doors, trade groups expressed deeper fears. If Burkina Faso reduced its reliance on frozen imports, and if Mali, Niger, or Togo followed, billions of euros in annual exports could evaporate. What critics mocked as fish diplomacy was beginning to look like an economic disruption with teeth. Meanwhile, Africa itself responded with curiosity, even pride. Youth movements in Mali and Niger celebrated Traoré as a symbol of innovation, sharing his images under the banner of Africa Rising. Delegations traveled quietly to Ouagadougou to study the initiative, hoping to replicate its success. At African Union meetings, Traoré's words carried unexpected force. We do not need food aid. We need to breed our rivers, feed our people, and free our sovereignty. Applause in Addis Ababa echoed far beyond the hall. Beyond Africa, other global powers took note. In Moscow, strategists observed carefully, framing the initiative within the broader canvas of Russia-Africa relations. For Russia, which had sought to position itself as a partner in African self-determination, the optics of fish as sovereignty fit neatly into its anti-colonial narrative. In Beijing, too, observers speculated whether aquaculture might become a new arena for partnership, a way to invest without the baggage of Western aid. What startled global commentators most was the symbolism. For generations, Africa had been portrayed through images of famine and dependency. Now international audiences saw something different. A young leader standing not in foreign capitals begging for loans, but in his rivers, releasing life. A politics not of words, but of water. Still, skepticism persisted. Critics continued to warn that fish could not shield a nation from drought, corruption, or global markets. Yet even as they doubted, the sight of rivers renewed forced them to reckon with a possibility that sovereignty might one day flow not from foreign capitals, but from Africa's own streams. And so the question pressed itself onto the global stage. Would this bold gamble remain a local experiment, or would fish diplomacy cascade into a continental tide that no foreign power could control? The rivers of Burkina Faso now shimmer with life, but their currents carry more than fish. They carry questions about resilience, sovereignty, and the path a continent must choose. Ibrahim Traoré's gamble was never only about filling stomachs. It was about rewriting the script of dependence. Yet as the applause rises, so too do the risks. The dangers are real. Illegal fishing threatens to empty the waters before populations mature. Corrupt local officials eye profits, eager to monopolize distribution. Pollution from gold mining clouds riverbeds, poisoning habitats before they stabilize. Climate change itself hovers like a shadow, promising unpredictable rains and devastating droughts. A movement built on rivers must confront the reality that rivers are fragile. Without vigilance, gains could dissolve as quickly as they appeared. But alongside these dangers are opportunities. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso can envision true food security rooted in its own ecosystems. Markets no longer depend solely on lorries from coastal ports. Fishermen have returned, women's cooperatives are thriving, and schools are feeding children from their own waters. If sustained, this model could become a template for the Sahel, proving that sovereignty begins not in speeches or summits, but in the ability to nourish one's people. Beyond economics, the symbolism reverberates across Africa. For too long, the continent has been told that progress must arrive in crates marked with foreign flags. Yet the fish release suggests another truth, that dignity is not imported. It can be bred in rivers, harvested by calloused hands, and sold in local markets. It is here, not in distant capitals, that African revolution takes root. The choice before Africa is stark. Will nations cling to dependency, waiting for aid and handouts, Or will they follow the currents toward self-reliance? The story of Burkina Faso shows that even a small, landlocked country can defy the logic of weakness. If rivers can be reclaimed, then why not land, minerals, and industries too? Why not rewrite the balance of power so that sovereignty flows from African soil and water rather than foreign debt? Elders across the continent recognize the moment. Our ancestors fought for flags, one elder in Ouagadougou said, but flags alone cannot feed children. This is the independence we prayed for. His words echoed across radio stations, stirring a pride that transcends borders. For a generation that has grown weary of aid dependence in political theater, the rivers offer something new, proof that action, however humble, can restore dignity. The path ahead is uncertain, but the tide is shifting. Burkina Faso has cast its lot with rivers and resilience. The question is whether other nations will dare to do the same. And so Africa stands at a crossroads. If rivers can be reborn, what else might be reclaimed? Will this be remembered as a fleeting spectacle, or the first ripple of an Africa rising that no tide can drown? From the moment Ibrahim Traoré released 150 tons of fish into the rivers of Burkina Faso, the narrative of a nation began to shift. What the world mocked as folly, villagers embraced as freedom. What critics dismissed as theater, communities experienced as rebirth. Fishermen returned with heavy nets, women built cooperatives, children tasted fresh protein, and elders spoke of dignity restored. A simple act of life in the water had become a declaration of sovereignty. But this story was never only about rivers. It was about power, the power to feed, to resist, to imagine a future unbound by dependency. A nation that cannot nourish its people cannot truly claim independence. Traoré understood that food is not merely nutrition. It is leverage. It is stability. It is survival. By restocking rivers, he restocked the spirit of his country. Each fish symbolized not only a meal, but a quiet revolution, a promise that Burkina Faso would no longer beg for what it could provide itself. And yet the challenge endures. Corruption, illegal mining, and climate volatility threaten to undo the gains. Sovereignty once won can be lost again if vigilance falters. But perhaps this is why the moment matters most. It reminds Africa that independence is not given, it is sustained. Sustained in the soil, in the rivers, and in the will of the people. So the question reaches beyond borders. If rivers can be reclaimed, what else might Africa reclaim? Minerals, markets, mines? Will this be remembered as a curious gamble or as the spark of an awakening that reshaped a continent? The answer lies not only with leaders, but with ordinary voices. Voices willing to declare that dignity is as essential as bread. If this story moves you, do not remain silent. Like, share, and subscribe. Not for numbers, but for the future our elders dreamed of. The rivers of Burkina Faso have spoken. Let us echo them. For those who believe in an Africa rising, for those who know that sovereignty begins with the power to feed, this moment is not the end, but the beginning. They mocked fish, but fish fed a nation. They mocked a gamble, but a gamble sparked a movement. And so we say again, Ibrahim Traoré dared to cast hope into uncertain waters, and in doing so, he proved that even the smallest ripples can set a continent free.